All right, so welcome everybody. I want to quickly introduce Dr. Evan Kahn here. He's the owner of North State Sport and Spine in Holly Springs. He's our title sponsor for Carolina Multisports. And I'm also a client of Dr. Kahn's. I see him quite regularly, and he and I were just chatting beforehand. I've had a little hip issue that I've been working with Dr. Kahn for, I guess, over a year now. It's been very slow, but his methodical process has led me through a gauntlet of other professionals that he has coordinated through. And everybody that I've met with has just been super impressed, as well as myself, with Dr. Kahn's approach to help him get the right information he needed, like an MRI scan and other things, to get that information into his office, into his eyes, so that he could help me. And I tell you what, I've been turning the corner, and it's been fantastic to see him work, and to work with not just his office, but the community at large, like I said, to get me to where I am. So I highly recommend him for those purposes, but at the same time, really want to thank Dr. Kahn for putting on this web series here for us. We've already done the swimming anatomy, and tonight we're going to do cycling anatomy, and then looking forward, we're going to do two more. We're going to do a running anatomy, as well as a just general strength training web series anatomy class later this fall. But tonight, let me go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Kahn, and let's chat about cycling.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. Thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. And we're going to go over some very interesting things about the anatomy of a cyclist and the biomechanics of cycling. And I hope that we can get a few things out of this. We're going to go over a few different topics. What are the muscles that are kind of most active during what we call the power phase? And then what muscles are most active during what we term the recovery phase? And then how can we train and strengthen these muscles functionally for cycling, for the specific purpose of cycling? You can always just hit the gym and do what you want, but let's try to make it functional. So, and then try to target what we want to do. So first off, let's kind of go over what the pedal stroke looks like. And typically we use terminology that is best to describe it using like the numbers of a clock or the degrees from 0 to 360. And this diagram is just a nice image that depicts kind of all those things, where it correlates to which muscle of the body is powering which part of the spin. So, and just briefly, looking at the leg on the right, we can see that the glute at the top left is going to be active first, followed by the muscles of the quadriceps, followed by the muscles of the calf, then the muscles of the shin, the muscles of the hamstring, and then the muscles of the hip flexor. And that completes the spin cycle, the pedal stroke. And what we're going to see, though, is it's not always quite as simple as that. This is a pretty kind of, I would say, a dumbed down version of what we're going to see, but this is a great way to just kind of visualize which muscles occur kind of at what times. And here on the left, we have an image. It's another just kind of an easy version, digestible version of where in the crank position, which muscles are active during which part. And you can see that in the left, the hip flexors are active kind of at that 10 o'clock position, 11 o'clock position, all the way through, getting you through the what we call top dead center, or the 0 degree. The hip extensors are going to be active very early on at top dead center, and then continue on all the way down to the pedal stroke. And then we see what's happening at the knee in this diagram. And where the knee extensors, which are the quad muscles, where they're active, where the knee flexors are active. And I will say, take these images with a little bit of a grain of salt, because these images are from 1991. And so there's probably a little bit of an updated version. But this was just a very easy, digestible graph that we can use. Okay, so moving on to the first part, the power phase. So the power phase of the pedal stroke is defined by the areas of the spin between 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock. And as you guessed it, the power phase is where we're going to develop most of our power. We're going to develop a lot of speed. So what's active during the power phase? And we'll use that 0 degree mark, or what's called top dead center, or 12 o'clock, as kind of the start of it. And so the glutes are most active, particularly glute max is the most active from top dead center. And that's going to go all the way down to about 130 degrees. Right after that, we're going to get some quad activity from the two muscles of the kind of the lower portion of the quad, called vastus lateralis and vastus medialis. And they're going to be active. Let me see if I can, oops, sorry, hang on one second. I just have to move that guy over there. There we go. Sorry, one second. Let's just minimize you. There we go. Okay, sorry. Quad, 2 of the 4 quadricep muscles, vastus lateralis and vastus medialis, they're active right before top dead center. And they go all the way to about 3 o'clock. So they're going to help, they're going to activate even before you get to that 0 degree mark, and really start pushing right afterwards. Now, what's going to get us to top dead center? Well, that's our hip flexors. And rectus femoris is one of those muscles that helps do that. And that's going to activate right around 9 o'clock and finish right around 3 o'clock. So that's going to help pull the hip and leg forward, and then get us going from the glute side of things. Once we kind of get past the larger muscles of the hip and the quad, we're going to get down to the calf. The calf starts to activate right around 30 degrees, so probably around 2 or 3 o'clock, and finishes later on in the cycle around 270 or 90 or 9 o'clock. There's a deeper muscle called the soleus, which activates a little bit later and finishes a little bit earlier. And then the hamstrings are actually active right after top dead center and finish a little bit later in the cycle. But this also depends on who you ask, because each research article was a little bit different. And we'll get into the hamstrings in just a little bit too. But it's important to note that the hamstrings are active during the power phase. And just kind of interestingly enough, I found that a couple of muscles fire twice. They'll have like short little bursts. And that just depends on kind of the person, the position on the bike, how fast you're pedaling, if you've got what kind of shoes you're in, if you're in clipless or clipped-in shoes. So the recovery phase, well, that's defined by pedal stroke at 6 o'clock, between 6 and 12 o'clock. And so what's active then? Well, that's a lot of that is hamstring. And again, the hamstrings are active during the power phase, which is interesting, but they do finish kind of in that between 6 and 9 o'clock type part of the spin. And then the front of the shin, that's a muscle called the tibialis anterior. That's going to help pull the ankle upwards towards your body. It activates right around 9 o'clock and finishes right at top dead center. Here's a graph that I found that highlights these particular muscles in what's called an EMG, or which is a nerve conduction study. And just to kind of orient you here, we're going to look at the image on the left, highlights all of the 10 different muscles that are typically more easily researched in the spin. And if you look at the x-axis, At 0 degrees, that's top dead center. That's your 12 o'clock. To the right of that number is going to be the degrees moving forward. To the left of that number is going to be kind of coming back up in that recovery phase. And our y-axis is going to be the percentage of maximum contraction. So 1.0 would represent 100% of maximum contraction. 0.2 would represent 20% of maximum contraction. And the muscles that are highlighted here are the muscles that we just kind of went over. And at the top, we've got muscles of the shin, the tibialis anterior, which is TA, the soleus, which is a muscle of the calf. The second row consists of the gastrocnemius, which is your big calf muscle. And here you get to see that kind of double peaked portion of that. The third row consists of the muscles of the quadricep that we're interested in, the vastus lateralis and the vastus medialis. And you get to see their large peaks and kind of a big duration of activity. Just below that, the one on the left, the RF, stands for rectus femoris, and it's the hip flexor. And look how active that muscle is, starting at that minus 135 all the way up into closer to 90 degrees. That muscle is very active, and it peaks right at top dead center. The next two, the biceps femoris, which is BF, and the SM, or semimembranosus, are two hamstring muscles. And look at the peak on the hamstrings. We're seeing them right after 90 degrees is when they're peaking out. So it's not necessarily during the recovery phase when they're most active. It's more during the power phase. And then let's look at glute max. Glute max is our last one, bottom right. Big muscle, charges forward, activates right around top dead center, stops right around 135. And just one more graph for you. This is a bar graph that kind of covers that exact same information, but we can, if you want to refer back to this one also has a key of all the muscles that are activated. So interestingly enough, a couple tidbits here. We've got the glute max activity it's greatly influenced by pretty much how much you work. The higher the wattage, the higher the glute max activity. And I think the inverse is probably true here, where the higher the glute max activity, the higher the wattage. So for those looking to try and kind of get their glutes more active, we need to get a little bit more power out of it. Well, basically the harder you go, the more you'll get out of it. As pedaling rate increases, we also notice a shift earlier in that pedal cycle with respect to the activation of these muscles. So as pedal rate, as you spin faster, the timing of those muscles activates quicker. So let's say you've got a muscle that typically activates right around, let's say 1 o'clock. And you're speeding up. Your revolutions are going faster. They're going higher. Well, that muscle might activate a little bit earlier, let's say 12:30 or even at 12. And that's probably in order to keep up and continue creating torque. And the most effective force application at the start of the power phase is right around the 300-degree mark. So probably around that 10 o'clock, the most effective force application at the start of the power phase. So how can we, where should we begin our power phase? Where should we be thinking about generating the most power? Should probably be right around that 10 o'clock mark or the 300-degree mark. And where is that? Which muscle is really active during that phase? That's our hip flexors. So with all that said, let's talk about which muscles are more designed for power and which muscles are more designed for stability. So the muscles that are involved with power, the ones that are going to generate more power, are typically ones that only cross or deal with one joint in particular. And just to kind of narrow it down, and just to use the same muscles that we were talking about before, we're talking about glute max, the muscles of the quad, and the muscles of the shin, and one of the muscles of the calf. But which muscles are involved with stability? Well, it's been hypothesized that muscles that cross two joints are they're primarily functioning as either a stabilizer or an energy transfer role. And I think that's really interesting. Muscles that are crossing two joints. So muscles that pretty much cross both the hip and the knee, or the knee and the ankle. Those muscles are transferring energy, and they're also providing stability towards those joints, centrating those joints so that the power muscles can work even more. So which of those muscles are they? We're talking about the hamstrings, one of the muscles of the calf, and the hip flexor. So how can we use this knowledge to our advantage and train these muscles functionally? So if we're going to train, if we want to train for power, and if certain muscles are known to be the primary drivers of power, well, then it stands to reason that we want to train those muscles with power in mind. And so primarily, we're going to be looking at glute max and the quad muscles. And it's something interesting to keep in mind when we're thinking about power. Power is an equation, and it's strength times velocity. It's how strong a muscle is and how fast it can move. So when a strong muscle moves at a very fast rate, we call that power. So how can we gain power in some of these big glute muscles and these quad muscles? Well, we do want to do some squats and some squat variations. We do want to produce get some knee extensions, some single leg glute exercises. And these are just some examples. There's only about 1,000 different exercises to do. And we'll cover that a little bit more during our resistance training webinar. But in order to get strength, we have to train at a higher rate, at a 70 to 80% of your 1 rep max. That's kind of where we want to be training in our majority of our training. And we're training for speed. That's a slightly different topic. We can take a lower weight and work very fast through these exact same exercises. They don't have to be much different, but we can try to be faster, maybe at a lower rate. But if when we get to combine both strength and velocity, well, that's when we really create some power. But which muscles are more designed for stability, and how can we train for them? Well, those stabilizer muscles are gluteus medius, which we didn't really talk about today, but it's a big time hip and pelvic stabilizer muscle. The core muscles, hamstrings, and your hip flexors. So how can we train those? Well, in order to train core, I think for a triathlete, it's important to get into planks and do plank variations. I think being in those positions can be extremely helpful, and just helps create that core stability. And for hamstrings, hamstring curls, extremely important. You can do those weighted, or you can do them with a exercise ball. And what I like for those types of exercises is, if we're going to train for endurance, we're going to train for stability, then I think it's more important to do more higher rep type workouts. And I think if you look at the research for a lot of this stuff, they're going to gear you towards more just fast twitch muscle firing a lot. But I think for endurance athletes, we do have to get some endurance training in there, that's not related to just cardiovascular, but also for resistance training. So I think higher rep, lower weight, that stuff works fine when we're talking about stability, and we're talking about, in particular, hamstrings. And I just think it's important to stretch. I mean, can we just stretch a little bit? I mean, you guys are on a bike for hours, you run for hours, you swim forever. I mean, it would be nice to just stretch just a little bit. I think it would probably help you out just a little bit. And then lastly, I just want to briefly go over a position that we all know well, the aero position. It's a very advantageous position to get into, increases speed, improves your aerodynamics. But from a medical standpoint, we look at this position and we kind of cringe because it puts a lot of repetitive and enduring strain on muscles of the lower back, the upper back, the neck, the shoulders. It puts your hips in a position where if your bike fit isn't just right, we can get some hip impingement. Sustained posture here can lead to lots of neck pain, forward rounded posture, lower back pain, and even what we call ulnar nerve neuropathy, which is tingling in the pinky and ring fingers. So if you ever had tingling in those digits, it's very common. And it probably comes from being on the bike a lot and being in this position. So the aero position, good for you, bad for you, both the same. I mean, it makes you go faster, but you'll also probably be seeing me the more you're in it. And that's all that I've got for today. Happy to
Well,
go.
Evan, can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you.
Yeah, I've got a couple of things. I just made a couple of notes there I wanted to bring out, and then maybe have you elaborate on a few of those. And then, of course, if David and Chandu had any thoughts or questions or comments, we'll invite those as well. But going back to one of those graphs, I'm not sure which graph, it probably doesn't matter of which of all the muscles. Actually, go forward one. I can't. Actually, go back to the circle one. I think that one would be the easiest one for our conversation here. Yeah, this one right here. I was just going to point out, or actually, you know, Evan and I were talking before the call here about this here, and one thing, especially as a coach, that I come across is a lot of people, when they think of cycling, they only think of gigantic quads or gigantic calf muscles. And when it comes to cycling, that's obviously important, but it's not the full picture here. And when it comes to strength training, it's so important, especially with clipped in pedals. You know, I teach, you know, the pedal stroke, and I have drills on the bike. You know, we don't think of a lot of drills on the bike as we would in the pool or running drills, but there are a lot of drills on the bike that we do. And one of the drills we do is a spinning drill, where we're literally isolating one leg and doing single leg spinning drills, and also spinning drills where we're focused on just the upstroke or just the overstroke or the understroke or the downstroke. Again, those are all different portions of that full 360 degrees. And I've never seen this graph before, but it just brings to light very easily all those muscles that are required simultaneously in many cases, or as you know, to get them around that full circle. Some are stopping, some are starting, and the strength that are required in each one of those to have a stable pedal stroke from start to finish. So my full point is here, if we just do lots of squats or something like that, just get massive calves or massive quads, in the gym, you know, by just doing a couple, 1 or 2, 3 exercises, we're not getting a full power output here. And from an endurance perspective, again, cycling and triathlon cycling are two totally different sports. We won't go into the nuances of either or individually, but point being, you need a strong pedal stroke from 12 o'clock all the way back to 12 o'clock. And sometimes that takes, you know, stepping back. And in my case, you know, working on the glute med, you know, stabilizing my hip so that my hips can work appropriately and properly in an endurance perspective. But, you know, sometimes it takes a step back, like I was saying, and not necessarily always focusing on those big, massive muscles, but all those little muscles. And I love planks. I love things that are designed to work on the core and other things, because the last point I'll make here, and then I'll open it up to your comments, Evan, and of course David and Chandu too. But the importance of the muscle chain and how it operates. How all of these muscles work in synchrony. In other words, when we think of a symphony, we've so many different instruments, and when they're all doing their thing at the right moment, at the right time, at the right intensity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it sounds beautiful. But all of a sudden you get that weird, horn sound over here, or that offbeat drum sound, it takes very little to make it sound terrible. And so thinking of it in that way, your muscles are a concert of all these neurological activities firing all those muscles, in our sequence to get it to perform the task that we're trying to get it to perform. And it can be quite a symphony. And if there's any dysfunction in that muscle chain, it'll come out. Knee pain, ankle pain, hip pain, it will have a conversation with you. and listen to that conversation, and have those conversations that you're having with your bike with Dr. Kahn or a physical therapist before they become a major issue. But anyway, anything to add to that, Dr. Kahn? I just love the symmetry, or not the imagery here of all these muscles, when they're working, why they're working.
Yeah, I love that. Everything works in concert, everything works in sequence. And you're so right. It's so important to have balance and not be so quad dominant, but to be able to create a nice fluid motion all the way from 12 to 12. And that involves using a lot of different muscles. It's not, I might have harped on just the power aspect of having strong glutes and quads, but if you don't have strength elsewhere, you're gonna have an imbalance, and you're gonna start relying on those other muscles more and more. And the more you get into it, whether it's longer miles or more frequency, just higher volume, that leads to repetitive motion injury, and that leads to pain, and that leads to now you're down, and now you're having to rehab it. And the rehab really is just stuff that we should have been doing 6 months ago, and it probably would have prevented it to begin with. So it's a great point, just to have a nice, even, very balanced mindset when it comes to activation.
Quick coaching tip here. The way I coach also the pedal stroke, and I've come up with this on my own because it was the only thing that was making sense to people. So let me know if it makes sense to you. But when we're pedaling, we have opposite or opposing feet, right? So half of our body's doing this, that we see in the chart here. The other half of our body's at a completely different area. They're doing totally different muscles are working on different sides of our body. Now, when we're clipped in, we're obviously trying to have a smooth pedal stroke all the way around. When we're pulling up, like I said, the overstroke, the understroke, the backstroke, front stroke, all of it, not just a powerful downstroke. And then we relax on the upstroke, recovery stroke. We still do need a nice, powerful, full circle, not just, I guess recovery phase can be a little misleading there.
It is.
Where I'm going with this is you can imagine maybe being on the moon. What would a weightless spin feel like? Because as you're pulling up on one side, you're pushing down on the other side, and you're assisting both sides simultaneously. So you have smooth circles around on both sides. And the best way, like I said, that started to make sense to people is kind of a weightless feel on the bike, because you're not just pushing down all the time. You're pulling up and pushing all at the same time. And when you really feel that synchrony of pulling up and pushing down, it's almost a weightless feel on the bike, because as your butt is sit on the seat, you're pulling up on one side and you're pushing down on the other side and switching that. And as you're switching so quickly, there may not be very much weight on that seat, as an example. So anyway, think of it in that terms of, cycling with a weightless feel, almost like you're walking on the moon, just a very gentle, weightless feel that you're cruising down the road. So,
I love that. That's great.
David, Chandu, any thoughts or questions for Dr. Kahn?
This is Chandu here. No, but just luckily no injuries or nothing with respect to the cycling. Just trying to increase the speed, as you mentioned that how you strengthen out and develop that endurance fitness, and because it's the catch 22 always for me. I mean, like, I can do the 60 miles. Other day I did Raven Rock on May 7th. I did Raven Rock 60 miles ride. That is a very, very hilly, demanding. The always a debate. Okay, as you mentioned, doctor, endurance, you work on less weight and more reps, and when you want to work on the strength side, increase the weight or do the quads or that, something like that. But all as a cyclist, triathlete, I am looking for is how can I increase my speed, apart from maintaining the endurance distance that I can do it. But I want the both of the worlds, like speed and also endurance. How can we achieve that? Is always in my mind.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, that is like the question of really any kind of endurance athlete and cyclist is how can we increase both? And I think I would, the answer I think is to know kind of where your baseline is right now. Do you know what you're averaging miles per hour on the bike? Just say on that 60-mile ride in Raven Rock, do you know what you averaged?
You're muted, Chandu.
Well, let me put it this way. If I've got someone who is averaging, let's say, 13, 14 miles an hour, 15 miles an hour, and they have trouble, let's just say I would assess if they have more of a weakness in the strength or the like endurance component. And if I think that I've got someone who's profoundly weak and just can't get enough power behind, enough wattage behind, because they literally just aren't strong enough to produce the pedal stroke, a good strong pedal stroke, well, then I'm just going to work on their power. I'm just going to work on their strength. I'm going to work on their strength more. If it's more of like, yeah, I can create high wattages, I just can't keep it there. Well, then that's a whole different story. That's being able to access all of your reserve energies and still be able to like increasing like your lactate threshold and stuff like that. And Joel, you can probably talk a little bit about this too. But let's say, Joel, let me put it on you. What would you do with someone who can produce a lot of wattage but just can't do it for more than, let's say, 5 minutes?
Yeah, 13 miles per hour is my speed in that 60
13?
miles,
13? Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, so I would be thinking like, okay, well, I would think you would probably need a little bit of strength. And I think increasing your muscle strength you'll probably be able to keep the same kind of turnover, but you'll be able to produce more wattage at a higher RPM. So Joel, would you agree with that?
Yeah, and where I was going with my thoughts there is there's a difference between fatigue resistance, as Evan's alluding to there. In other words, I've got the power, I die after a certain while. I can't continue to produce that power over a long period of time. And so we do a lot of what we call fatigue resistance training, and consistency is the main point there. It's not that we go out and do these mega rides all the time. It's we do much shorter rides. Going back to the an example that Evan gave, you know, a lighter weight but more reps is kind of what we're doing there. We're still doing long rides. We're just not doing mega hard rides. And we're building what we call that fatigue resistance, doing a lot of long rides at low intensity or a quote unquote lightweight, like we would in the gym. And if you'll use kind of the 80-20 rule, 80% should be zone 2. And if you don't know what zone 2 is, then you're going to be training at the wrong intensity, and you're not going to be able to get the appropriate output that you're wanting. So there's two different zone 2s here. There's a wattage zone 2, and then there's a heart rate zone 2. And I always initially defer to the heart rate, because at the end of the day, if you're always training at a threshold heart rate, you're not going to have the energy systems there to produce the power. If you're constantly revving your engine in an anaerobic way, you're always hitting your threshold. You know, you're burning sugar like crazy, and therefore that's your primary fuel source, and it's not going to last very long. But when we become what we call fat adapted, we're burning fat as fuel, which is more readily available. It's more stable in the body. You know, the average person, even your skinny people, have, you know, 30 to 50,000 calories of fat available for fuel. And so therefore, like I said, it's more stable. But that is used in an aerobic situation. In other words, zone 2. So there's two different tests you need to do. You need to do a heart rate test on the bike and figure out where your zones are so that you can appropriately train about 80% in zone 2 and about 20% in those much higher intensity situations over a training cycle, whether it be a micro like a week or a macro, you know, over a season, a full year or something like that cycle.
Okay. I have a indoor home Wahoo kicker. You know, that's what I do the zone 2 training it in my home
Well, that's
based
where I
on the
was
heart.
going to next, is your power. So your other power zone you're going to look at is, you know, what are your training zones for power? And again, you're going to set that with what we would call a functional threshold power test.
Yeah.
In other words, we want to know where your zone 2 and your zone 4 are, and you're going to train in those two zones. And again, 80% you want to train at zone 2 wattage, and then about 20% of the time you want to train at your threshold wattage and above, so that you can train those muscles. And then over time, the fatigue resistance comes into play, where we can last for longer and we're not always dying. And so if you, like I said, it really starts right there, knowing those numbers, power zones and heart rate zones. And before you can really push the power, you got to have the engine, you know, your heart, providing all that fuel to the working muscles. Does that make sense, Chandu?
Yeah. I think I will reach out to you to schedule some time to talk. And you know, my problem is not having a plan. You know, like for me, I am not me being a consultant. I don't have time to sit and, you know, already the things that you chalked out, right? I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I mean, it takes longer, and you know, that is the reason I think whenever I see these kind of sessions, it helps me to. I have the knowledge, but the only lack of thing is a plan for me to implement, you know, for my
Yeah.
triathlon journey.
Well,
And I'm looking for a
you
long
hit the
term,
nail
right?
on top
So
of the head.
yes.
Yeah, consistency. You know, that's what I said earlier. You know, just consistency is very, very important. And in fact, our newsletter just went out. I had it scheduled to go out at 7:30 tonight. So your email should have my newsletter in it. There's an article in there about running, but it's by the running PTs. but it applies to any sport, being consistent. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're a weekend warrior, you go out and do a big long ride for 2 or 3 hours on Saturday and then don't do much the rest of the week before you get back to the weekend again. You're not strength training. You're not, cycling at those lower intensities, throughout the week. Then it's just going to be much more difficult to see any gains at all when you're not consistent. And I know life gets in the way. My training plan changes quite frequently because my wife tells me I'm going to do something when I maybe don't want to do it, and and that's not all bad. She told me I was going camping this weekend. I said, "Oh, really?" I said, "I got 2 big bike rides actually, and I do planned." But she said, "No, you're going to go bike riding by yourself in the mountains, and we're going to go camping." So at any rate,
so I will reach out to.
Yeah,
I'll reach out to you,
consistency.
Joel.
Just remember that.
Yeah, I will reach out to you, Joel. So because I signed up for October 70.3. So
yeah, awesome.
So
well, David,
I just want
do you have any thoughts or questions? David may be okay, but we'll see. Evan, any last thoughts from you, or any wrap-up thoughts or anything?
Man, consistency. I think that's such a great theme to end on. With anything. I mean, consistency is so important to be able to carve the time out, put in the time, come up with a plan, talk to Joel, coach is going to come up with a great plan for you, and you're going to get better. I mean, no matter what, you're going to improve if you have a plan. There's no doubt about it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, just one last thought too, Chandu. You were mentioning your ride was very hilly, and one thing I've talked with my coach a lot about is, we all have different bodies. We're all predisposed to different abilities, and there are different races out there. There are races that are very flat. There are races that are very hilly. And we can be predisposed to be better at one or the other. So take, for example, a flat course. When do you ever get to rest on the bike? You don't. It's constant pedaling. If you stop pedaling or slow down pedaling, or put less effort and less power into the pedals, you are going to slow down, especially if you have a headwind or crosswind or something else that's exterior that you can't have any control over. So those can be deceivingly hard. A flat course can. A lot of people think, a flat course is, I want to do a flat course first for my first big race. Well, that may or may not be the best course for you. So talking with a coach and figuring out your strength as well as your technique and your bodily structure, all of those things. With a hilly course, yes, you are going uphill quite often, but it's like intervals all day. You get to rest going down a hill. Now, depending on the steepness of a hill, I would coach you either to tuck and coast, and you can go 5, 10, 15 miles an hour faster than actually pedaling, because when it comes to aerodynamics, when we're actually pedaling, that's creating a lot of wind resistance. But when we stop pedaling and we tuck everything in together, that air can rush right by us, and it's less wind resistant. So we can rest going down hills a lot of the times, give those muscles a brief recovery, and then we can get back to work going up a hill. And so I'm not saying a hilly course is necessarily easier, because again, depending on our body structure and our type, our strength, all those things we talked about, a flat course versus a hilly course may be easier or harder for you. And it might be something where also you're consistently also requires the right type of training. So if you're doing, you say Ironman North Carolina in October and Wilmington, that's a flat course. So you should do a lot of flat riding to build that fatigue resistance, because if you're doing a lot of hill training, you're actually getting a lot of rest going down hills, and you're not replicating that 20, 30, 40 minutes of just constant pedaling at the same wattage. So finding nice flat areas that you can ride in for very long periods of time are going to help with that. Again, not doing it all the time or every day, but at the right intensities at the right times, as we alluded to earlier. The 80-20 rule is going to help with that stamina, and consistent training on the right types of courses too. So David said he's having mute issues, no questions here. But much of this info was new to me and very helpful. So yeah, I'll post this as well so that you guys can certainly go back, have access to these charts, as well as Evan's comments about going through each of those graphs and what we've talked about tonight, as well as friends or anybody you know who you might even want to send this out to that didn't attend tonight. They're welcome to obviously view this as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and close if there's no last thoughts or comments.
Yep, perfect. Thank you, guys. I appreciate all the help.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, David and Chandu, for joining us. And thank you very much, Evan, for taking the time tonight. I know your time is very valuable, and really do appreciate the knowledge you've been able to share with us, especially from your perspective, the very scientific, technical end of things that really actually shed a great light on what we're doing here to keep us safe and keep us going in the hobbies that we love. So thank you again.
Later,
yeah,
guys.
thank you,
Bye.
Dr. Kahn. Thank you, Joel.
Yep. Thank you guys very much. And thank you, Joel, for having me. It's always fun to do these, and I look forward to the next one.
Yep.
Yes. So again, next we'll do running. So all that's on my website. Just get on my website. If you're on my mailing list, those will also come out. But we'll do running anatomy next, and we'll see you then.
Yep. All right. Y'all have a good night.
All right. Have a good night, guys. Thanks again. Take care.